Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad you all could make it today. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Katie Magoon with People Solutions Center, and she's going to be talking with us about Your Candidates Are Talking. Are you listening?
Great. Thank you. So how many of you have had the opportunity to actually be on the candidate side of the hiring experience in, say, the last 5 years? How many of you would, if you had the opportunity to volunteer, would try to do that again if you had a choice? There's a few. It's not the best experience in the world, unfortunately. And part of what I really want to talk about today is the reasons it isn't that companies haven't done a great job in the candidate experience space, and more importantly, why I think it's critical for every company to step back and look at their hiring and selection process through a candidate lens. And so we're going to talk about where are we missing as employers between how our candidates want to be treated and what we're actually doing to them along the way. During my 2.5 years of consulting, I've had an opportunity to meet a ton of folks in transition. Some of that just came from when you say you're in HR and you're out networking, people are like, oh, I know somebody who's looking for a job, so they introduce you. But the other part of it came from, as I started to do that, I found it really rewarding to work with folks that are in transition, not as part of my company, but because it's just the right thing to do to help folks. And in doing that, I met a whole bunch of people who had one horrible candidate experience story after another. They've ranged from interviewer never showing up to individuals who actually looked at candidates in the interview and said, I'm sorry, why are you here? I personally had a senior leader at my prior company. This is one of my fun, horrible candidate experience stories, but useful as a tell-all. She actually went into an interview with a candidate. It was shortly after lunchtime, late in the day. She had not had lunch. She had a smaller office, but she decided to eat her lunch during the interview. Not great, but not the worst thing that could happen, unless you choose to eat a tuna fish sandwich in a closed office with a candidate. We heard about that one during our follow-up with the candidate. And all I could think was, thank God it's not me, because tuna fish actually does make me ill, so that would have been a problem. I had a candidate once tell me, as when I was recruiting director, I actually got a survey back from one of our candidates. And in the survey, she explained how she was a fairly tall female. 5'8", 5'10", somewhere in that range. She walks in for the interview, and apparently the individual doing the interview was uncomfortable with her height. And so they walked back from the front door into his office, and she sits down, and the manager proceeded to stand up on his chair and say, oh good, now I'm back to being the tallest person in the room. I seriously, I read it, and I'm like, no, it didn't happen. And then I thought, well, who would write that and make it up? So I called her and I said, can you tell me more about what happened? She went over the story. I called the manager and I said, hey, tell me about your interview with Susie Smith. And I made a joke that day and it might not have been that funny. Might not have been. So it's these kinds of things that over the years I've picked up from real experiences in listening to people about what really happens when you're a candidate and where it can go horribly wrong. And there's some really good reasons that companies need to step back and do this. And to be honest, we've spent so much time in an employment market where we could easily say, well, if they want to work for us, they'll put up with anything. And that's still the approach that many organizations are taking to their actual selection process. So for those of you that I don't know, brief bio on me. I spent 20 years in the HR field. Several of those were actually as the recruiting director for Progressive Insurance. So when it comes to candidate experience, we actually did a candidate experience survey every month. We surveyed every single candidate that talked to a recruiter and then went anywhere in the process, even if they got turned down. And one of the things I had to do on a monthly basis was sit and read all of the comments from every single one of those candidates. Luckily, as we got better at this and we spent time fixing those things, it took a lot less wine to get through all of those. I will tell you the first couple of months were a little on the rough side as we really started to hear what our candidates were telling us. So the question you have to ask yourself when you think about your own organization is, could this really happen to people at your company? First and foremost, there is something in the candidate world called the black hole. And it's where you think your resume went when you applied for a job. You've put it out there, especially with the advent of applicant tracking systems. I've applied and I never hear back. This is probably one of the biggest frustrations from candidates, is just that sense that I have no way to know if anybody even looked at it, and I certainly don't know if it got the appreciation it should have along the way. The famous in an interview, sorry, I need to take this phone call. This is still becoming actually more common because of the advent of these. And we're so attached to if this rings, we're supposed to pick it up, that people have forgotten the concept of desk phone. And you tended to get better about not answering that. But that cell phone rings and we think it's urgent. My favorite question, crazy questions in interviews. If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? Ironically, being in recruiting, we've heard this joke over and over. If you were a crayon, what color crayon in the Crayola box would you be? All these questions that really have no relevance to the job, but people thought they were fun. And in human resources, you heard these jokes, and I'm like, nobody actually does that, right? 6 months into my consulting firm, I got a phone call from a woman, and she said, can you take a look at my questions that I ask in the interview? Tell me if I'm doing this right. Sure. So she sends me over her list of questions. 50 questions. And I called her because I thought maybe I misunderstood. I was like, you're picking some from these, right? Oh no, I ask every candidate. And I was like, oh no. And then for the first time in my career, the myth was broken. It actually on paper said, if you were a tree, what tree would you be? And I actually had to call all my friends at my last job and go, it actually exists. It's not a joke anymore. But it's questions that really don't have an answer. And even if they did, I don't know what they would tell you about whether or not the person could do the job. And they're a horrible feeling for a candidate because what would you ever say? And the famous, I'm sorry your interviewer isn't available. I have had candidate after candidate tell me they actually showed up at the company, dressed up, suit and tie, ready to go, and nobody was available to talk to them. It's these kinds of things that make the candidate experience a horrible outcome, but also the thing that everybody dreads. And in reality, at the end of the day, I cannot tell you how many employers I'm talking to every week going, oh my gosh, Katie, I can't hire enough good people. I can't grow because I can't hire enough people right now. And yet, I will have an afternoon full of coffee with people who are candidates going, I just keep getting treated horribly day after day. So why does this matter? And the first time I really realized candidate experience mattered, I was sitting, I was recruiting director role, sitting in a room full of our entire recruiting organization, and the CEO of our company was coming in to speak. And he was supposed to speak on something actually completely unrelated to recruiting. He was just our annual presentation to the recruiters. And he walked in and said, before I even start, I'm here to give you all a message. And he said, if I get one more phone call from someone that says, I was treated so horribly in your recruiting process that not only would I never want to work there, I will never have use your product again. He said, we are throwing all of you out and starting from scratch. He said, it is happening over and over, and this can't be the experience that we have for folks. So why does candidate experience matter? And I tell this to employers all the time. Your candidates are your customers. And 90% of the time for all of us in some sort of a service industry, that candidate that you treated horribly could be walking out the door and tomorrow making a decision on whether or not to use your product. And to the extent that that is absolutely a true statement because you're in a service industry or you're a product that every person could be thinking about using you, this becomes that much more critical. The candidate experience surveys we read over and over again said, based on the way I was treated, I would never use you for my insurance carrier. If this is how you treat your candidates, I can only imagine how you treat your customers. And so while we think of this as a different pool, people are really actually paying attention. The obvious competition for talent is a pretty, the unemployment rate is at an all-time low. I have a client right now who's looking to hire an accountant. She is facing a 1.4% unemployment market to hire an accountant. I'm like, yeah, you better treat them nice while you have them. Better make sure that every minute you spend with them, they feel good, even if you don't give them the job. And then most importantly, one of the key things is retention. Once you have good people, you don't want to lose them. There's a lot of statistics out there today that say, if I come in on my first day of the job and I did not have a great candidate experience, I am far more likely to leave than if I had a great candidate experience and now things are going well. And the reason is from a mental perspective. I've started, but all I'm thinking is I took this job, they didn't treat me great as I was coming in the door. Now I'm here, I'm gonna kind of wait things out and see how this goes. So I'm starting with a filter of, I'm gonna see how they treat me versus if they've had a positive candidate experience, they're walking in the door excited, enthused, this is a great place to be and they treat their people really well. There's a big difference in how you filter every little thing that can go wrong in onboarding, and we all know it can. But if you're looking at it the lens of, there's already been some signs that this isn't a good fit, you're going to make that decision to leave a whole lot faster. And so that candidate experience makes a big impression on people as they lead up to it. And we don't always know from the very beginning which of these people we're going to hire. So if the candidate experience goes wrong, you can't always put the bet that that's the person that's going to end up walking in the door. And the last piece is cost per applicant. We spend a lot of money to get applicants in the door. Even just to post on Indeed, companies are spending thousands of dollars for every applicant that they get just to get the chance to look at their resume and do an interview. And then we treat them poorly from there on. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. I did an interviewing skills class earlier this week, and several of the folks in the class were talking about the fact that they're running into a phenomenon of candidates not showing up for their interviews. And they're like, it's really bizarre. Like, you're looking for a job, I call you, I set up an interview, and you don't come in. And they're shocked. Smaller businesses, but they're still like, I don't understand this. A lot of it has to do with, there's a lot of factors, their industry and so forth, but one of my questions to them was, what did it sound like when you called them to make that interview? How did you sound excited to talk to them? Did you treat them like a real person? Did you send them a confirmation and tell them where to go and make them feel welcome? Or was it a 2-second transaction to say, please come in at 10 o'clock, and now they feel like they're a number from a resume that they walked in the door from? So that cost, but they spent a lot of money to get them, so they darn well better make sure they transition over. Every touch point makes a difference, even down to when you turn someone down, how are you doing that? Is that a phone call to say, thank you for putting in your resume? John's looking at me like that does not happen. Or and if it's a standard email, does the email at least sound engaging and grateful? Like, I appreciate the fact that you took time. Does the email, I rewrote emails for one of my clients. We redid the entire interview process. He's in a super tight industry, small business, absolutely required to, he needs every person he can get. And so we rewrote every communication that goes to a candidate from beginning to end, including the ones that say, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person on Tuesday. I recognize in advance that a candidate, that going through a selection process can be challenging and frustrating. Here's some information that might be helpful to you. All of a sudden, it makes it about the person who's looking for the job. And in their case, they're a home healthcare industry. They need people who care about how you treat folks, because I got to go send you to my client and I want you to be nice. Well, if I'm not nice to you in the interview process, you're probably not going to be nice to my clients when you're taking care of them. But it's the little things, it's the word choices, it's the communication, it's whether they even send communication, which is part of what can be really uncommon.
So I think part of the problem is there's lack of measures and accountability. For example, how many people are coming through the interviewing process, and how many people actually you made offers to that turned you down? How many people dropped out of the interviewing process? And so who's ever, both the hiring manager and the HR, if they're not being held accountable for statistics, like a salesperson's being held accountable, then they just keep doing it.
Yeah, they do. And we used to, my prior company, they got over 300,000 resumes a year. It's a big number, 300,000. Wow. We hired less than 2% of the people we hired, or the people that applied. 2%. So think about how big the pool is of people left who, if we didn't treat them well, it's a lot of people to have angry at your company. And if you didn't know those numbers, I mean, I could write on any given day, I could write on the wall for each of our jobs. Here's how many people applied. Here's how many people got to the next step. Here's where we're losing folks in the process. And we'd go back and look at not only why are we losing them, but more importantly, if it's because we turned them down, are we treating them the way we would want to be treated? It's stressful to look for a job. And it's amazing when you say that to people and they go, oh yeah, it is. I'm like, yeah, it's really, like it is an emotional roller coaster. I've got a session I do for individuals in transition that's called Managing Your Job Search. And the first 10 minutes of it is all focused on how do you manage your emotions during a job search? How do you deal with the fact that you're going way up here because you got the phone call for the interview and then you went on the interview and the person wasn't nice and now you're crashing? How do you get so your your whole selection process does this? Because otherwise you'll wear yourself out while you're trying to look for a job.
Can you talk about how social media, when people have these negative experiences, go out to these websites and then
Yeah.
you can get to that point?
Yeah, social media has changed all the ball games, right? Because we used to even be able to make customer service mistakes and you could kind of get away with it as a company. Now I post on Facebook. And now I go out and talk about how bad this experience was or what happened. I actually spoke last year to the director of recruiting for Southwest Airlines. And I asked her, I said, so tell me what you all are doing in the space of candidate experience. And she chuckled. She said, you know, we do amazing things at this company. And she said, and I can't get our candidate experience initiative off the ground. And I said, well, what do you think that is? She goes, the closest I've gotten to getting people engaged was actually through social media. Her call center director set up a photo booth in the area of the call center where they tend to do a lot of their interviews. And now when they have candidates come in for their interviews, they can hop into the photo booth and hold up the sign that says, I interviewed with Southwest, and then post that on their social media. She's like, and so it's really cool because we're a big company and people think it's cool that they got an interview with us. And she said, so it goes over really well. She said, until we make them really mad. And she said, and then I have somebody holding the posting that said, I interviewed with Southwest, and they never called me back. She's like, we're working on the second half of that process. But here was a really cool way to advertise and brand their company using social media. It's just as damaging if you don't have the follow through. So a couple of things. The great part about candidate experience is this is not rocket science. Candidates aren't looking for the moon and the stars or anything crazy. They just want to be treated politely. They want an understanding of the company. They want it to be easy to apply. You talk about the applicant tracking systems and some of the ones that are a little bit more frustrating. They want timely communication, and they want the chance to share their skills. One of the questions I use in every interview I've ever done comes from this concept. I read this in one of the comments somewhere along the lines. This person said, I had this great example I wanted to share, and I was waiting for the perfect opportunity in the interview to share it. And I got to the end, and the manager never asked anything where it would have made sense, and I walked away knowing I didn't get to show you my best self. So I added a question at the beginning. I tell people about it at the beginning of my interview. I ask it at the end. And at the beginning of the interview, I will say, look, I have a set of questions and things that I'm looking for, but it's really important that you walk out of here feeling like you got to tell me about your best self. So at the end of the interview, it's not a trick question, but I'm going to ask you, is there any example or information I should know about you that you didn't get a chance to ask or answer during the interview? If you don't, if you got it all out there, great. But then you're not sweating out every time I ask a question whether or not this is the time you can share your example. Something so small. I had seen candidates I had one I thought was going to cry because she was like, somebody actually cares if they hear what I want to say. So it doesn't have to be these huge Herculaneum expensive processes, but treat people with respect and it'll go a long way. Listening to the people, a lot of times interviewers are trying to check a box. They're not actually listening to what's being said. Some of them get so into writing their notes that they forget to look up. I had managers once who asked me if they could type their notes because they can't read their own handwriting when they're done. And I was like, well, you tell me, because we're going to sit here and have a conversation, and I'm going to type the notes while we talk. You let me know when you're done whether or not you think you should do that. They were like, yeah, that would be bad. I'm like, good. I'm glad we got that conclusion all on our own. So what the candidates want is not hard. And this survey information, has anybody here heard of the Candy Awards? So there is actually, on an annual basis, there is an organization of, that has come together and put together what they call the Candy Awards, which is Candidate Experience Awards. And you submit as a company, you submit your process, they do a survey of your candidates, they look at the best in class from a candidate perspective. And every year they publish a new white paper on what candidates said they cared about, what companies are doing that is now best in class, and what's still happening that's the same thing that's happened for years and years and years. So if you're ever looking for where do I fall within that benchmark, that Candy Awards white paper is an excellent resource to give you just some good information and data that's out there. So if you had to rate your candidate experience on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being you're making everybody really happy, where do you fall? How many people put their experience at a 3 or better? Great. How many folks are as far down as the 1? No, we're looking at the higher range. That's great. A lot of companies haven't ever stopped to think about what this looks like. And sometimes it's not just how you've laid out the process, but it's who's executing on your process. So are your managers doing the right things? Your top 5 things to make sure you're focused on. Steve, here's your, listen to your candidates. This means these surveys are amazing pieces of information, and it doesn't have to be super slick. SurveyMonkey does wonders. But send a survey out to people and say, hey, you met with us. Tell us what you thought. That in and of itself will shock candidates that you actually cared, and then if you do something with it, even better. The other upside to these surveys is that at the end of the day, it also gives you a heads up if somebody thinks they had any discrimination issues within their process, because they'll put it in their survey, and now you have an opportunity. The number of times that I could pick up the phone and say, you know what, I read your comment, and I understand you had a concern about how your interview went. Can you tell me what happened? And once they started breathing again, because they realized that somebody actually read the comment that they wrote, and they explained, here's what happened in the interview, I was like, you know what, let me look into this for you and see what we can do. And that was game-changing, not only in terms of candidate feeling good, but probably kept us from going down the path of potentially an EEO case or any other thing that could happen. So things to be aware of. Overcoming technology issues, applicant tracking systems, they aren't built for the candidate, just so we're clear. They are built for the employers 100% of the time. Making your interviews personal, these are people. They're human beings, they want to be treated as such. And then most importantly, communicate, communicate, communicate. Most employers do not follow up with their candidates once they've been turned down, or if we do, we don't follow up in the time frame that we said we would. So we follow up, we say, we'll get back to you next week, and then guess what? Our decision doesn't happen next week because life got in the way, work got in the way, but call and tell somebody. Let them know, hey, that decision was delayed. This is what's going on. Because that candidate is sitting home, maybe hoping you call back and holding off on accepting another offer, or just thinking, gee, I must have blown that even though I thought it went really well. There's all sorts of emotions that go on in that, and just out of courtesy, send an email. It only takes 2 seconds. But telling people where you're at, particularly because in this day and age, you'll lose them and they will go somewhere else, and they might have been the candidate you wanted the most. Yeah, so I had a candidate last year, one gentleman I was working with while he was in transition. He had gone to the same company for 8 different interviews. He was scheduled for his 9th interview. Same job, same company, 8 interviews. You're pretty much thinking you got this one, right? You've been 8 different times and they've scheduled you for a 9th. You're like, this is in the bag. He stopped every other part of his job search. He was sure he had it. They called him between his 8th and 9th interview and said, I'm sorry, but we're going to cancel that 9th interview. We've decided to go a different direction. I'm like, oh, he called and told me, and I'm like, oh, I'm just sick for you. I don't even know what to tell you. There can be litigation, but here's what I found. If you're treating candidates fairly all along the way, they're not happy that they got turned down, but they're not likely to run and sue. Because to be honest, it's a real pain to sue a company. It is not easy. So if I feel like you at least respected me and valued me, then when you call and go, I am so sorry, we had an internal candidate pop up at the last minute, and we're not going to be able to move forward. Or we had another candidate who had great experience, and we just decided to go a different way. When you're honest with them, and you're honest throughout the process so they know it's genuine, they're likely to not be happy, but they're not likely to go sue you. And so if you just, we used to tell, not only did we tell people exactly why they weren't hired, but if you were an employee referral, we had a policy that said every employee referral would get a phone call from our recruiting team telling you not only whether you were being moved forward, but if you weren't, why. And they would, had a whole team of people, their whole job, 8 hours a day, was to call people and tell them they were being turned down and give them coaching on it. Hardest job ever. We finally had to come up with a different process because they're like, I can't be yelled at that much. But they did say, more often than not, people appreciated the fact that somebody actually gave them a real reason. It was, you know what, we have people that have 5 years and you only have 2. So when you treated them fairly, they actually were so grateful that, well, I couldn't have done that job. They were fantastic at it. So in interest of time, I do want to make sure we hit this last one. And this is make the offer welcoming. And this sounds so obvious because of course you would make it welcoming. You're having this person join your company. I will tell you, most offer letters that I see start with, here's the 10, welcome aboard, we're excited to have you. Here's when you start, this is where you park, and here's the 10 reasons I can fire you if you don't act the way I want you to. And by the way, could you bring your information for the I-9 form? Like, welcome aboard. It's all these communications, but the offer conversation has to be really, really spot on. You need to make sure it is welcome aboard. Here's what you can expect on your first day. Here's what you might want to think about wearing. And some of that should be a conversation. It's not just the offer letter, which tends to be where we feel legal, we have to be all legal. Your offer letter should really be a welcome letter. And then you can have, if you need an attachment, like here's a couple things you need to know about that we're going to have to take care of on your first day, like an I-9 form and things like that. But the first part of the letter should really be welcome. And here's what you can expect. We do have a coffee maker in our break room. Feel free to use that. You will have a refrigerator if you'd like to bring your lunch. Those kinds of things, so that when people walk in the door, everything else that they're already stressed about a new job is at least as calm as it possibly can be, and they know that they've been treated well from day one, so that when they walk in, they have the expectation they'll continue to be treated well as you go forward. And if you turn them down at any point in this process, if you've treated them well, you have left them walking away saying, you know, I didn't get that job, but they were an amazing company. And that's the brand you need when you're trying to hire so many people in such a tough unemployment market. They are, but I will tell you, I have seen resounding, like, I would go work for that company, you should go work for that company, I would do business with that company, which is even better. So hopefully, again, just 5 top best practices. I've got slides behind this that when we send it out, it'll give details on each of these areas, things to think about, things to go back and look at your own process through the candidate lens, because we tend to look at it through the HR, am I being efficient lens. So, all right. Thank you all very much. And I'm going to have Sam do our wind up. So hopefully this is all good information. But Sam, I'll let you do wind up.
That was awesome. And that was really good information, things that I think people don't think about. And one reason why I think it's very timely is, I don't know, I'm not going to speculate on ages of any of the people in the room, but I can actually remember when people applied through a job on paper. Did any of you actually ever buy the nice thick paper to make a resume for? You don't have to raise your hands, but I'm one of them. Oh, did you raise your hand? Wow, that's impressive. Let the record show we have a millennial that did a resume on paper. But now it's so easy, even as a small business, when we post a job opening, we get hundreds of applicants, and that's a lot of people to upset, because you're only hiring 1 or 2. And with technology now, it's so easy for people to apply, and it's so easy to gain that negativity on social media and get a bad reputation and upset a lot of people. So it's very useful information. Very good job. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. I also want to give a special thanks to Steve Finkelstein. He gave me a signed copy, look at this, someday it's going to be worth something, this autograph in the book. He's written a book, it's Execute to Win, and the idea behind that is, you can have a great plan, but if you don't have a great execution, then where does that get you? With a great plan and nothing happening. And so he's written a book about it, and it's available on Amazon. They can go out to Amazon.com and order the book if they're interested in it.
It's on Kindle, as well as I'm going to talk to you about on tape.
There you go. There you go. Perfect.
And I do have a section on my website called Chronicles of a Candidate that I've started. Folks have sent me stories of things that have happened, and typically what I'll do is put in, here's the stories. I do not name companies. I keep everything very, very cool and upfront, but then I also add in, from an employer's perspective, here's something you might want to think about either putting in place with your process or changing about processes to keep that from happening with your candidates. So, and if you've got stories, feed them my direction, because they're always, and like, it's always good to have more to put there.